that mixed methods is becoming increasingly important. It's well recognised. There's a whole journal associated with mixed methods research, and there's an awful lot written about it. So what we're going to cover in this session this evening is starting off by defining what we mean by mixed methods and how that fits into or how it relates to quantitative and qualitative research, how I should say quantitative and qualitative approaches can complement each other. Sorry, it's a typo on my part. Look at the different mixed methods designs that are available. Look at when mixed methods designs might not be appropriate to use. It's not a panacea. And then we'll look at how, as I've said earlier, how mixed methods research has been used in 2 PhD programs, my own from a few years ago, and Amy's, who is well on with hers now. And then there'll be an opportunity for some questions and discussion later on. So as we go through, if you have any questions, please feel free to type away. I'll try and do my best to keep on top of looking at both the chat as well as continuing with the slides, but please do contribute as we go through. It's meant to be interactive. It's not meant to be a one-way street, but we'll try and leave at least sort of 15-20 minutes at the end to sort of take any questions from you. Hopefully both me and Amy can contribute to that discussion. So first off, let's start off with some definitions. Now, I suppose what I should start off by saying is that in the strictest sense, we tend to think about mixed methods research as being a combination of some way of both quantitative and qualitative research. It doesn't have to be. Okay, now it can be just a combination of 2 different quantitative methods or 2 different qualitative methods. But we're going to stick to this sort of more general definition, that it's a methodology that involves collecting, analysing, and integrating both quantitative and qualitative research. Okay, and the purpose of doing that is that ultimately we're trying to get a better understanding of a research problem. It's trying to recognise that there are limitations or possible limitations to either quantitative or qualitative in trying to answer some research questions, not all. Okay, we need to be pragmatic, but often mixed methods research can help us to have a much deeper understanding of a research problem. So the key aspects are that we collect both quantitative and qualitative data, that we integrate them in some way, and as we'll see later on, that can be either during the analysis, at the point of analysis, or more frequently it tends to be at the point of theoretical interpretation. And what I mean by that is that you undertake a quantitative analysis of the data that's quantitative in nature, you undertake an analysis of the qualitative data separately, and then you have, once you've done that, you use some method to try and bring those together in the discussion of both of them in order to try and answer an overall aim or research question. And as we've said here, it can be either a single study with a fairly straightforward, simple research question, or it can be a multiple phase project too. So for anyone not familiar with mixed methods research, it's become more of a movement and a third paradigm in recent years. I say recent years, I'm probably talking about the last 2 to 3 decades, really. There is this sort of dichotomy between quantitative and qualitative research. And I'm going to get you to do a little bit of interaction now. And in the text box, in the chat window, I'd like you to just quickly type away as where you see yourself predominantly from a research paradigm perspective. So do you feel that you sit more comfortably as a positivist or an interpretivist? I.e., do you feel more comfortable with qualitative research in order to answer problems, or quantitative research? Thanks, Leslie. So you can be honest. And if you want to say both, that's fine. Sorry, that's my text. Okay. Hi, Sue. I kind of guessed this would be the response, that there's a mix, but there's a sort of a preference or predominance for qualitative research, and that's fairly typical of health and social care research. Personally, as we'll see later on, I align myself very much as a pragmatic researcher, and the important thing for me is this. The final bullet point on this slide, that in my view, a researcher, their stance must be one in such that they choose an approach that is best aimed at answering a particular research question. And I'm pretty sure that hopefully all of us can agree with that. So I used to feel more comfortable with quantitative research. I would say I now feel equally comfortable with both, and that's largely because of the sort of recent research I've been undertaking that has required a mixed methods approach. So why mixed methods then? I'm not going to dwell very much on this slide. So what is it about mixed methods that, what does that provide us that either quantitative or qualitative research on their own are unable to do? And I think one of the key points on here is this one here. Is that policymakers are starting to see research methods of being able to give them much more insight into a problem. Not just the quantitative data, not just the qualitative data of the how and the why, but how they interact and why that's so important in order to solve problems and to help us to improve our service. So for me, this is the biggie. It's having a much stronger impact on policymakers. It says here that it's cost effective, but actually, as we'll see later on, that's probably debatable. I think it's probably, in some circumstances, it's actually more costly to undertake mixed methods research. That's something that shouldn't be done. So some reasons for mixing methods, and I've tried to summarize them here. I'll just quickly go through each of these. So under validity, yes, what we're aiming to do in terms of validity is to corroborate both the quantitative and qualitative strands of a research project. We can draw on the strengths of both quantitative and qualitative to offset the weaknesses of both. It can give us a more complete picture of a problem. It's a more comprehensive account than we can get through either qualitative or quantitative alone. In terms of dealing with different questions, both quantitative and qualitative can answer different questions. So as we'll see later on with my example of a mixed methods study, I had questions that were predominantly quantitative in nature, some that were predominantly qualitative, and some that required a combination of both. In terms of context, yes, we know that, for example, that qualitative can explain quantitative results or vice versa, or the quantitative results might provide us with some general information and the qualitative provides the context for that. For example, a randomized controlled trial might give us some quite specific information, but some of us may be aware that randomized controlled trials can be quite limited in terms of context, is because variables are so tightly controlled. So additional qualitative information can provide that useful context. Unexpected results. So we might see some surprising results in, say, a quantitative strand, and the qualitative strand might help to explain those, or vice versa. We can use mixed methods to help us develop instruments for research. So, for example, we might use a qualitative strand that is employed to design an instrument, and then that instrument's tested. In terms of sampling, one approach might facilitate sampling from another. Credibility, I mean, both approaches together can enhance the integrity of findings. Under illustration, qualitative data can help develop breadth and depth for the fairly limited quantitative data, and so on. So there's all sorts of reasons as to why we might want to mix both quantitative and qualitative data in a mixed method study. Okay, I've just noticed that Amy needs to be added as a moderator. So just bear with me for a sec, please. Okay. So, as for different approaches to mixed methods, this isn't exhaustive, but these are sort of typical designs, mixed methods models. They can either be sequential in nature, or they can be, so these are sequential, and these would be considered to be parallel designs. So if we think about the first one here, what we've got here is, for example, where we know relatively little about a research problem or a research setting. So the qualitative study can explore that, identify, provide some clarity about the kinds of variables that require further investigation in a quantitative study. And then that can be followed by another qualitative study that explores the issues raised in the quantitative study to get some deeper understanding of what they mean. We can do quantitative first and then qualitative. Thanks, Leslie. So quantitative study could be used to identify important themes that qualitative fieldwork could then deepen. The quantitative survey could be used to identify groups of respondents with, for example, strongly contrasting views about a subject, and these polarized groups might be used for follow-up qualitative interviews to gain a more in-depth understanding. Then we have these sort of concurrent designs or parallel designs where the data can be either collected continuously, both for the same cases, such as this one. So this is a similar theme, or you might have different themes where you're collecting data on different themes through two parallel approaches. So different ways of approaching mixed methods. So the next thing to think about is how we might integrate the quantitative and qualitative data. And generally, there's two ways you can do this. Probably the most common way is this one. Try and get my arrow working. It's not working. There we go. This one here, whereby you undertake separate analyses of the quantitative and qualitative data, and then trying to bring them together at the point of discussion into some sort of single coherent framework. It's generally interpretive in nature, in the sense that you're trying to make sense of two different sets of data, and it can be quite tricky to sort of reconcile data that is different in both the data sets. And as I'll show you later in an example, you might see evidence of a theme in one set, in say the quantitative data set, that is not matched in the subsequent qualitative investigation. So essentially what we're trying to do with integrating this, both quantitative and qualitative at the point of theoretical interpretation, is to use something called a convergence coding matrix. So it's a way of triangulating both the quantitative and qualitative data. And I'll show you an example of that in a bit, one that I've used. Another approach that people try to do is to integrate the data at the point of analysis. So this means that you try to sort of combine both sets of data as you're analysing it, rather than analyse them separately within their own paradigms and then discuss how they combine. You try and do this at the start. And there are two possible ways of doing this. A mixed methods matrix, which I've tried and I've found problematic, and I'll try and explain why, and following a thread. I've put up here, it's some consider it a better approach. I'm not so sure, but some research studies might lend themselves to one or both of these, or either of these methods. So in terms of integrating at the point of theoretical interpretation, so after you've looked at both of them separately, we have this sort of thing called a convergence coding matrix. So what you do with this is you display the themes. I'm not going to dwell too much on this because I've got an example later. So you display the themes that are evident from one or both methods in one column, and then you try and see where the evidence was present in both quantitative and qualitative, and then you can identify whether there's agreement, partial agreement, dissonance, or silence. Silence is where there might be evidence of a theme in one of the data sets, for example, the quantitative, and it's absent completely in the other. Dissonance is where they oppose each other in both quantitative and qualitative, and as you can imagine, agreement and partial agreement are fairly straightforward to understand. So the reason I like this approach is that it reflects the strengths of the different methods. You analyse them separately, you recognise the strengths and weaknesses of both the quantitative and the qualitative data, and you're not trying to transform data in any way. And that's something that often happens with mixed methods research, where you try and integrate the data at the point of analysis. So this is one of the methods for integrating at the point of analysis. So this is following a thread, and I'm trying to remember it's Moran Ellis from 2006 who proposed this. So they define combinations like a sequential use of quantitative and qualitative, where one's used as like an adjunct to inform or flesh out the other, rather than positioned as an equal contributor. So certainly with this approach, we see quantitative and qualitative as completely equal contributors. With this, we tend to have one being sort of more important than another, and it tends to be that where the qualitative strand is more important than the quantitative. So what we tend to do with this approach is you do an initial analysis for each approach, identify the key theme, and then you try and follow that through into the other data set to see whether it's consistent throughout both quantitative and qualitative. So it tends to be something that's useful in more qualitative approaches, or certainly where the qualitative aspect of a mixed methods study is considered the more important one. Now, mixed methods matrix, this is useful potentially where you've got both quantitative and qualitative data on the same cases. So excuse me while I skip back, for this kind of approach here, for the third one here, so whether you're continuously collecting quantitative and qualitative data on the same cases, it's possible to use this mixed methods matrix, and I've tried to do that. So what you try and do is summarize both data sets. What you have to do is try and transform some of the qualitative data into some sort of quantitative data so that you can analyze it with the qualitative data, with the quantitative data, if that makes sense. And that can be really tricky. And I have a problem with that, in that I don't think that's easy to do, because it's trying to sort of force a qualitative construct into a quantitative one. I don't think that works very well. This is an approach that's been who was the proponent of this? I think Miles Huberman was the proponent of a mixed methods matrix. Again, I can show you, talk a little bit about an example of this. I tried to do this in some research of my own, where I had a huge amount of data, and I ended up with something like 5 matrices for every individual case, and it became far too unwieldy and complex. So this approach might only work if you've got relatively limited data. So I think it's better to sort of look at a couple of examples. Now, what I'm going to do is we're going to have a look at two examples from PhD studies. First off, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own PhD, and then I'm going to ask Amy to sort of cut in and start to talk a little bit about hers. So just very briefly, so a few years ago, my PhD was all about how we can use immersive virtual environments to allow healthcare students to enhance their spatial cognition of anatomy. So their ability to build 3D mental maps of anatomy, and it specifically focused on the brain. So you can see here, this is the kind of, here's our student here, wearing his 3D glasses, and he's controlling this model of the brain. Now, you can't see this, but this student sees this in sort of stereoscopic 3D, and they can manipulate this model of the brain in, you're only seeing part of it there, but it's visualized in different ways. So it's a fairly straightforward study in the sense that I'm only going to dwell a little bit on these questions, but I'm not going to, in fact, I'm not going to dwell at all, only to say that if you perhaps come back to these later, what you might recognize is that some of these questions are more quantitative in nature. So, for example, the first one here is kind of mixed, but it demands more of a sort of a quantitative approach, whereas some of these are certainly more qualitative in nature. So, for example, number 4, how do students interpret and use models to enhance spatial and anatomical cognition of the brain? That demands a much more qualitative approach. That should be fairly obvious. But a lot of the others sort of rely on a combination of both of these data sets in order to answer them. And my approach was a convergent parallel design. So I collected quantitative data through a randomized controlled trial, and qualitative data was, the qualitative strand was constructivist grounded theory. So there's semi-structured interviews within there. And I use this triangulation protocol. So there's convergence matrix, which I'll show you an example of, in order to try and make sense of both sets of data together. So it's continuous collection of data for individual cases. So I analyze them separately. This was suited to this sort of approach of analyze them separately and then try and combine them at the point of theoretical interpretation, because the methods were prioritized equally. There was nothing in here to suggest that one or either of these approaches was predominant, because many of these questions relied on a combination of both sets of data. Now, initially, because I was because I was collecting quantitative and qualitative data for individual cases, I initially thought that this mixed methods matrix was appropriate. I soon found that as I tried to do that, it was ridiculously hard because of the amount of data that it was generating. So we then settled on this integration at the point of interpretation and a convergence coding matrix. which looks something like this. So there's 3 slides here because the table ran over 3 slides. So in column 1, what we can see is these are characteristics of both the user and the 3D virtual model, where there was evidence of impact on spatial cognition, where it was apparent in one or both of the quantitative or qualitative data set. So column 2 is what we found in the quantitative, column 3 in the qualitative, and then there's a code. So S stands for silence, D for dissonance, PA for partial agreement, and A for agreement. So we can see here, this is an example of where there was silence, in that there was some correlation, so some evidence in the quantitative findings of correlations between student stage of course and spatial knowledge enhancement, but it wasn't a particularly strong predictor. But it was, all this was completely absent in the qualitative analysis. So hopefully what you can start to see is that these sorts of, it starts to sort of put a weaker emphasis on these kind of quantitative findings, because there was no evidence whatsoever in the qualitative findings that these things were of importance. Individual traits, there was dissonance here. So there's positive correlation in association in the quantitative findings and in the regression model, but actually we found very different things in the qualitative aspects. So again, as we go through, in relation to the model, for example, one of the things here, one of the themes here, interactivity and the ability for users to manipulate the model themselves. So a statistically significant enhancement seen in the group using the virtual model compared to a plastic model, and prominent indication here. So what we found in the quantitative findings, although it was a significant enhancement, when we put that into a regression model to try and identify the factors that predicted whether, the factors that predicted this spatial cognition enhancement, virtual reality wasn't in itself a significant predictor, which was an interesting finding. And yet, certainly in the qualitative findings, what we found was that it was very prominent that the users found that this user-defined rotation was key to helping them to make sense of spatial knowledge of anatomy. So there's partial agreement there. And there's more examples here where there was agreement in both as well. There's a question there from Maria. How did you define cases? So cases, just the participants. So there were, in this particular study, Maria, there were 120, just under 120 participants. So they're the cases, but there are only about 25 cases where there was both quantitative and qualitative data, because a large number of the participants, they participated in the RCT, but they didn't want to participate in the qualitative study. So for me, the major challenges were that a mixed methods approach produces an awful lot of data. I mean, specifically in my case, because it was it wasn't a huge randomized controlled trial with 120-ish participants, but it's a fairly significant size. Then 25 sets of quite detailed semi-structured interviews, trying to combine, even with 25 cases, the quantitative and qualitative. That was really problematic, trying to do that at the point of analysis. It was difficult to do at the point of theoretical interpretation. So for me, it's quite difficult in the sense that you've got a lot of data. And the other 2 points on here actually are more or less the same thing, because there's a sort of an assumption that the constructs are equivalent, and they are not, as I'm sure we're all familiar with. We can't, quantitative and qualitative constructs are very different. We can't assume that they're equivalent, and therefore you have to be a little bit cautious on how you try and see where there is convergence. If we go back to here, for example, it's difficult. Well, I've made some assumptions here that there was partial agreement based on trying to make an assumption that these were analysed completely separately. So partial agreement on the basis that, okay, it was statistically significant difference, but it wasn't a significant predictor in a regression model, and yet it was very strongly viewed by individuals as being important. So I therefore consider it partial agreement. But it's quite difficult to actually make those judgments. Hannah, any tips on how to manage all that data? Organisation, I think. Managing the, I mean, you have to manage it. Are we talking here in terms of separately, both quantitative and qualitative? Yeah, okay, well, it's fairly straightforward in that way. And from a quantitative perspective, it's just being organised and having your, I mean, I used SPSS for my data analysis. And it's about getting really good support on how best to design the files within, whether you use SPSS or Excel or whatever, to help you with the analysis. It's really important to get that data put in there in the right way in the first place, because if you don't do it right, it becomes really difficult to analyze it. So that's where it's really good to get advice and support from someone who's experienced in using those bits of software. For qualitative, managing it is even more problematic because it takes so long to try and make sense of that qualitative data. I mean, a 25-minute, 30-minute interview produces pages of transcripts. And Sabrina's just put a point here. Do you recommend using software such as NVivo? I didn't. I was old school in what I did. Hi, Simon. I was old school. I did it basically. I transcribed it, cut and paste, and then went through it with highlighter pens and sort of backwards and forwards throughout the data. And I then sort of went backwards and forwards at this convergence phase, basically trying to sort of tease out what the key themes were. It came together. Angela's asked a good question there. Do you require an independent reviewer to validate your interpretation of the matrix? I think that's it's a good question. And I think it's definitely advised. So in my case, in my PhD study, I had good support from my director of studies, who worked quite closely with me on this and offered their own interpretations. And we had lots of discussions, sometimes disagreed quite a lot about what things meant. So that is a really good thing to do, is to not do this in isolation. Okay, now at this point, I'm going to stop. Ooh. Oh, okay. Is there anything we can do with your audio, Amy? You could probably phone me or something, and I can play it through try and play it through the speaker, through my webcam. Let's see if this works. So you'll hear my phone ring in a moment.
Hello.
Hi, Amy. Right. Yeah. Right. Oh.
Right, is that better?
Yeah, you need to turn your speaker off. That's fine. So I'm going to shut up. I'm going to turn my audio off, and I'm going to hold this to the webcam.
Obviously, I can type bits and bobs extra afterwards, and any questions, please just ask. Same on there, you can just type them in. So for my PhD, I'm exploring compassionate behaviours in cancer care. So it's a mixed method study, obviously, otherwise I won't be here presenting with you now. And what I'm looking at doing is I'm wanting to co-create a definition of compassion. You'll have to move the slide, sorry, Rob. It's locked me out of that, thank you. So I'm looking at co-creating a definition of compassion, and what I'm wanting to do is using students, photoradiographers and patients and public involvement to do this co-created definition. So I'm using an inductive approach, so I'm not wanting to test the theory. What I'm wanting to do is explore what knowledge and understanding is already out there. So because of this, I'm looking at using an exploratory sequential mixed methods design. So as Rob went through a little bit earlier, this is a more staged approach. So for my first one, I'm using qualitative focus groups. So these will be all conducted right at the very beginning of the research, and I've literally just done my first one today. And then what you do afterwards with the sequential design is you analyse the data once all of this qualitative data to start with, and then you do your schematic analysis from that, and then you build that into the second stage. So the second stage will be a quantitative stage, and this will be questionnaires which are going to explore a little bit further the understanding of what compassion is. So mine's a little bit different because normally with a sequential design, you're trying to test something. So your first stage where you've done your data analysis, and then you're creating maybe a tool, a questionnaire, or something that's going to be more generalisable. Whereas this, what I'm not wanting to do, I'm not wanting to test this, I'm just wanting to explore a wider. So even though it is a mixed method sequential, it's a little bit different like Rob was saying. So you could argue that the quantitative element is not as kind of statistical as what you would expect. And then from this, what I'm looking at doing is developing a theoretical model. So this is what I'm wanting to use to teach compassion in healthcare students. So if you can move the slide on next, please. Very strange not being able to do anything back. So like I say, I'm just starting with my data collection. So mine are more anticipated challenges, which I think are going to be occurring. I'm sure there's going to be many more as I go through the process. So my first one, what I'm anticipating is converting the themes into questions. So I'm conducting, it'll be around 9 focus groups, and then analysing all of that data, and then I'm wanting to take actual maybe quotes or opinions or general themes that's come from the literature, from the results of the focus groups, and turn them into questions which are going to survey the wider population of these participant groups. My kind of worry is it's going to have to be very difficult to not kind of dampen down what these themes actually were. So it's very easy when you're using lighter scales just to say, you know, do you agree, do you not agree? But this is not going to get the understanding about the actual why they believe that. So I'm going to have to make sure I have some kind of context and allow the people completing the questionnaires a text box to actually explain why they're giving that meaning to it. On the same kind of thread, the eliminating bias, because it's going to be very difficult for me to identify the themes and then not think, well, that's important, that's compassion, and then take that forward. So to get around this, you can look at doing things like member checking and going back and, developing the questionnaires with the people that have been involved with your focus group. So that's one method I'm going to look at for doing. I've put time as a resource. Obviously, with any work you undertake as an MSc or a PhD or anything that you're going to be doing, time is a problem. Say I'm going to have 9 focus groups, all roughly an hour and a half long, analysing those, and then the questionnaires are going to be going out to, at the minute, the sample size is looking about 600, so then going through all the data analysis, all the coding and recording, so that's going to be, quite labour intensive, and so like I said, data analysis in there. I'm looking at doing the matrix that Bob spoke about earlier, so it's getting kind of like coding almost. So what do the statements that are being said by the participants, is it actually, do the answers agree with this? So if they're ranking it a 1, but we give an explanation of something that doesn't agree with that, making sure that everything marries up. So I would say if you want to ask any questions at the end, me and Rob will jump in and help. But I'll hand you back over to Rob. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. I'll turn my phone off now. Thanks. Okay, I hope everyone could hear that okay. It's obviously clear to me because I've got the phone next to my face. But Amy, if you mentioned about using a matrix. Were you talking about this convergence coding matrix or this? If I just skip back. So this one, convergence coding matrix, or this mixed methods matrix. So is it at the discussion stage? All right, okay, so the same sort of approach as me then. Yeah. So what I didn't make clear actually in mine was that this was only an example. I did this was for combined two research questions. There are also convergence coding matrices for the other research questions that required a combination of both quantitative and qualitative. So that's something that's important to mention, is that these have to be sort of related to specific research questions. So very quickly then, so in terms of a summary of the benefits of mixed methods research, well, clearly one of the key benefits is that it enables us to triangulate quantitative and qualitative data. So we can see where there is convergence, whether both data sets corroborate each other and correspond, and if they don't, that can present the researchers with something interesting to try and tease out as to why one data set shows that something might work or might not, and another data set shows that it's actually not as relevant or important. It allows us to, well, it ensures that our findings can be complementary of each other. So clarifies the results from one particular data set. They can be clarified by the results of another. Particularly if you're using sequential designs, we can use the results of one method to help or inform a subsequent method. So we can use as we said earlier, a sort of a qualitative investigation to provide us with information to develop a survey. We can then undertake that survey, and then we can use the results of that survey to provide us with information for developing an interview schedule for a subsequent qualitative phase, to put some meat onto the bones of the survey, so to speak. Hannah, can I just check? I think you said that with a concurrent approach, you don't always use data from the same cases. You don't have to, no, because it might be that you have participants from an overall population. Some of them are only participating in the quantitative aspect, some are only participating in the qualitative. I suppose in an ideal world, you'd like them to be participating in both, but it's not absolutely essential. There are limitations, and one of the key things for me is that the constructs are very different. So, particularly where there's these efforts to combine and integrate data at the point of analysis. And if you read some of the work by, there's a slide at the end with some further reading. I think her name is Alicia O'Kehern, who works at the University of Sheffield. Now, from what I can gather from reading her work, is that there seems to be this sort of effort to try and encourage integration of data at the point of analysis, but I'm not so sure. I think there's probably as many problems as there are solutions with that approach, because you're trying to force two different constructs together, and I think that can be quite problematic. Trying to quantify qualitative data, you lose the essence of what you're actually trying to get with the qualitative data. Now, this is the point I made earlier. John Creswell pointed out that it can be cost effective and certainly from a service development and evaluation and from policymakers' point of view, it might be effective for them. But yeah, the actual research itself, because of how complex it can be, means that the cost can be high. It's difficult to manage large amounts of data. And the last point on here, I'm sure that you'll find as you, yeah, that's right, Amy, yeah. There are lots of studies out there that purport to be mixed method studies, but they're not really. I've read numerous studies in journals where they try to explain themselves as mixed method study, that there has been, yes, there's been a mixed methods approach in the sense that they've collected both quantitative data and qualitative data, and they've analysed both the quantitative and the qualitative data, but there's been no efforts to integrate them. And I think that's the key thing. As far as I'm concerned, I think it's only a mixed method study if there is an attempt, a serious attempt to converge, triangulate, integrate this data at some point, possibly at the point of analysis, probably more likely through the use of these convergence matrices at the point of theoretical interpretation, at the discussion stage, to try and make sense of these findings, particularly for these convergent parallel designs. For sequential designs, it's a little bit different because it's more staged. So it seems a bit pointless really putting this on here, but this is being recorded and it will be converted into a video that we can make available. I'll also disseminate this to the participants through networks and this further reading as well. But at this stage, I think it'd be good to sort of stop talking and to let you ask a few questions. We've got 10 minutes left.